This morning, we are going to shift our focus a bit. Now we're going to look at the international context and how other actors outside the hemisphere have impinged upon the survivability of these three authoritarian states. We're going to ask ourselves, what are the instruments that these external authoritarians have been using? Most importantly, how effective have they been? Do they really make a critical difference or not? If those external props were suddenly to disappear, would these regimes suddenly implode or not? Difficult questions, try to unravel causalities, but we'll do our best there. And then finally, we want to take a look at, are these external regimes working together in concert, or are there possible contradictions among themselves? To help us explore these topics, we have three really fantastic panelists, all good friends of mine. John Polga-Hemovich is with the U.S. Naval Academy. Their bios are on the Institute of the Americas website, so I'll just hit the high points. But John has a PhD in political science from the University of Pittsburgh. He is a well-published expert on Venezuelan military affairs in particular, and Venezuela-Cuban relations. Also very pleased to have with us Ivan Ellis with the U.S. Army War College. Ivan is a very well-published with encyclopedic knowledge of these issues, and he particularly is knowledgeable about Chinese activities throughout the Western Hemisphere. Then finally, Cynthia Arnson, who until just a few days ago was the long-term director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center, but she will remain at the Wilson Center as a distinguished fellow. Cindy is also widely published on Central America, on the role of the US Congress, on peacekeeping in Latin America, and most recently was the editor of this excellent tome, Venezuela's Authoritarian Allies, the Ties That Bind, which includes an article by John as well. So with that introduction, John, the floor is yours. Speakers will go on for 12 to 15 minutes, and then after the three, we'll open it up to a discussion among the panelists and a Q&A. So thank you all.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Richard, for that lovely introduction. I'm honored to be here with you this morning at this event and to share in such august company just a few weeks before the summit of the Americas. As we enter a new stage and new age of great power competition, I think some patterns from the previous era of global bipolarity are reemerging under new guises. One of these is certainly authoritarian state collaboration or cooperation, whereby autocrats in one place abet authoritarian persistence in other places. In fact, I think one of the keys to the survival of dictatorships after the third wave of democratization has been partnerships with and a reliance upon other dictatorships. What I'm going to talk to you about for the next couple of minutes is first and foremost, what authoritarian collaboration looks like today in the Americas. Secondly, what foreign policy tools autocrats have employed to support authoritarianism in other places. Third, the extent to which international support for authoritarian regimes has made a crucial difference in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And fourth, whether these powers are working together and how the US, and even though this is a focus of the next panel today, how the US and other states might exploit how those authoritarian powers are working together. I'd like to begin with what authoritarian collaboration looks like in the Americas. We have, three authoritarian states, very clearly authoritarian states that are the focus of today's discussion: Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And they have undoubtedly survived and at times thrived from the economic largesse of other authoritarian states and benefited from strategic contributions from these same countries in the domains, military, diplomatic, and intelligence spheres. We know that these allies range from extra-hemispheric powers like China and Russia, as well as Iran, Turkey, and even the United Arab Emirates, to strategic partnerships among each other in the hemisphere. In fact, I think it's very helpful to differentiate among types of authoritarian cooperation right now in Latin America. On one hand, we have interhemispheric, and on the other, extrahemispheric, right? In addition to the actors involved in these two types of collaboration, they can be distinguished. They're distinguished by whether that cooperation is motivated by interests or ideology. All right. So interhemispheric cooperation or collaboration initially was more motivated and united by ideology than interests. Right. Specifically, we know that Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua share economic, cultural, and diplomatic ties as like-minded Bolivarian states. Right, something that differentiates them not only from other possibly hybrid regimes in the Caribbean basin that may be teetering on the edge of authoritarianism, but also distinguishes them from other authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world. Right. In this way, ideology also unites, certainly unites Latin America's three contemporary dictatorships the way that maybe, socialist authoritarians or right of center military dictatorships in the Southern Cone supported each other during the Cold War. With that being said, in the past couple of years, Nicolas Maduro, Daniel Ortega, Miguel Diaz-Canel are all autocrats more interested in staying in office than disseminating this rival ideological model to liberal democracy. Okay. And of these three, very clearly, we can understand that despite its economic, political, and humanitarian crisis, Venezuela is certainly the hegemon of these three countries, providing even today economic and diplomatic stability to both Cuba and Nicaragua. Right. On the other side, we have extrahemispheric collaboration, which is certainly motivated more by interests than ideology. And I think making this distinction is quite important. This refers to the many ways in which China, Russia, and other smaller countries are helping to keep Latin American countries afloat, especially Venezuela. Rather than aggressively spreading a particular form of government, right, fascism or communism, Russia and China are more interested in creating global conditions under which democracy promotion is blunted and state sovereignty, right, in air quotes, is further entrenched because that helps them. They do not support authoritarianism per se. I think they seek to strengthen these regimes that are particularly supportive of their own rule. Right. That being said, there's a study published this year, an academic study showing that China's central government donations to Latin America during COVID were affected by the level of democracy in the host country. And this supports the argument that China uses aid to promote what we might call a Beijing model of autocratic development. So how specifically does this autocratic cooperation work? Well, authoritarian powers' motivations to provide support for fellow autocrats and to fellow autocrats are self-serving rather than driven by some ideological commitment to create an authoritarian international, to put it one way. Authoritarian leaders care first and foremost about maximizing their own survival by selectively supporting other acquiescent authoritarian regimes, maintaining or making inroads to geostrategic control and fostering their own developmental goals. Okay, so secondly, what are the instruments that these authoritarian states have used? Well, regardless of whether they are inter or extra hemispheric, we know that autocrats have used a full array of foreign policy tools to bolster the resilience of regimes in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, right? Among, military, economic, diplomatic, intelligence, I think the most powerful has been economic, or I will make the case that the economic tool has been the most important. And we can start with China. In broad terms, academic studies have recently shown that export dependence on China increases leadership durability in authoritarian regimes. Moreover, the data show that China's economic cooperation is associated with regime durability in party-based regimes, which is to say places that have political parties and maybe have elections even if they're not free and fair, right? In Latin America, we know that Chinese loans to Venezuela have provided critical support to Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship. They've contributed to the country's humanitarian collapse and raised broader questions about the transparency of Chinese capital in the region. Chinese trade, we know, with Latin America and the Caribbean has soared from 18 billion in 2002 to 450 billion in 2021, driven by demand for commodities. And we know that both Cuba and Venezuela have received significant assistance from China and Chinese government during the COVID-19 pandemic. And after November 2021, after Nicaragua recognized Taiwan as part of China, it also has been included in the as a recipient of that assistance. Okay, you know, economically, Russia is not as important, nor other states. You know, Russian trading goods with Latin America is quite small, especially compared to the United States and China. But in, you know, for China, it's been quite important. What other tools have been used? Well, technology. I'm sure that Evan today will speak about this. I don't particularly see technology transfer or technology sharing as being as important to authoritarian survival in the Caribbean, although we do know that China has sold security systems to, among other countries, Venezuela and under Rafael Correa, Ecuador, right? And Chinese surveillance has been a useful tool for the Venezuelan government. I'm not sure that's critical in assuring its survival, however. Diplomatically, we know that support from a host of authoritarian states and international fora, from the OAS to the UN, has scuttled votes that would punish those authoritarian states, right? We simply have to take a step back and note the countries that recognized Juan Guaido in 2019, which were nearly all democracies, versus those that did not, which were nearly all autocracies, right? Militarily, we know that Cuba has helped Venezuela revamp its armed forces and military intelligence service, beginning with agreements signed in May of 2008. The agreements stipulated or allowed Cuba to train soldiers in Venezuela, review and restructure parts of the Venezuelan military, train Venezuelan military agents in Havana, and change the intelligence service's mission from spying on foreign rivals to surveilling its country's own soldiers, officers, and even senior commanders. And given that the Bolivarian armed force is the most important institutional actor helping to keep Nicolas Maduro in power, this is quite significant, right? So there are lots of tools, and to say that there's some monocausal explanation or a singular tool keeping people in power, I think would be disingenuous, right? It's a combination of tools used in different ways strategically, given different contexts. I also think it's fair to say, you know, that international support for authoritarian regimes has made the crucial difference, right? In Venezuela, our minds immediately go to Russia and China, but other smaller countries have played a vital role recently as well. International support for Maduro's authoritarian regime has been crucial in allowing it to survive its devastating period of economic decline, punishing sanctions, and internal pressures for change, right? Venezuela's relations with Russia and China during the Chavez era of the 2000s and early 2010s resulted in tens of billions of dollars in loans, investment, and arms purchases, a significant portion of which remains unpaid. However, as US government efforts to crush the Venezuelan economy in 2019 and bring Maduro to the table, the negotiating table, accelerated, the purpose of Venezuelan foreign policy changed as well. And sanctions evasion, I think, became its central goal, right? And sanctions evasion hasn't depended as much on Russia and China as it has on other states, right? Specifically, Turkey and Iran have played a very significant role. Venezuela's strong anti-US posture has resonated with those two places, which are also being sanctioned by the US, and both have profited handsomely from their trade with Venezuela, receiving payments in gold for products exported to the country and helping to market sanctioned oil in the case of Iran, right? Notably, in April 2021, Conviasa, the largest commercial airline in Venezuela, established 30 new international routes connecting the country to many of its allies in the illegal gold trade, such as Turkey and Iran, as well as the UAE. And Cuba, for its part, has continued to receive shipments of Venezuelan oil, despite Venezuela's own severe fuel shortage. and has provided invaluable in-kind security and intelligence support, right? Without this support, it seems much more likely that Maduro would no longer be president. For Cuba's case, we know that the Cuban regime has been in a less precarious position in recent years than Venezuela. Nonetheless, Venezuelan oil shipments beginning in 2000 were instrumental in helping Cuba resist the economic hardship and diminishing international relevance following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the special period of the 1990s, right? And for this reason, Havana has had a compelling economic and political interest in the Maduro government's survival, right? This continues in 2004 with the establishment of the Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples of Our America, right, ALBA, and has continued even in 2017, in 2018, and 2019, as Venezuela has continued to ship oil to the island. Similarly, in Nicaragua, we know that its dictatorship has been a prime recipient of Venezuela's largesse and illicit financial linkages, beginning with Petrocaribe in the 2000s. However, Venezuelan aid to Nicaragua dramatically diminished between 2017 and 2019. But it's picked up again in 2021 after Nicaragua's sham elections. And it appears that Venezuela and Nicaragua are engaged in a mutually beneficial gold laundering scheme in which Venezuelan gold is flown to Nicaragua, processed and relabeled as Nicaraguan gold, and then exported and sold on the international markets. As evidence of this, the amount of money at stake is so large that gold surpassed beef as Nicaragua's most important export in 2021, with exports forecasted to top $1 billion in 2022, right? We also know that Russia, and to a lesser degree China, have important stakes in Nicaragua. Lastly, what is the role of these countries supporting each other, or are they working in tandem or apart? I think it depends on whether they're extra or interhemispheric. Extra-hemispherically, I do not really believe there is some autocrats international, right? These countries are not working in concert with one another. They have different interests and they lack a unifying ideology. As I've said before, Russia and China and Saudi Arabia are more interested in creating global conditions under which democracy promotion is blunted and they can entrench sovereignty, but they're not working together to achieve this. On the other hand, interhemispherically, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are working together in close concert with one another, driven in part by their ideology, but as well by the isolationism brought on by US sanctions, right? This is something that I'm sure we will get into in the Q&A and that subsequent panels will address, but authoritarian regimes, as the academic literature notes, often enter into different forms of collaboration when they feel they're facing an existential crisis, right? I think, the policy prescriptions are necessarily going to involve trade-offs. The question is, engage or isolate? There are no easy answers. Engagement and appeasement may encourage authoritarians to become more aggressive, while isolation ensures them turning away from the US and other democracies and reinforces their ties to China, Russia, and each other. So I think the question becomes one of not just engagement, but what type of engagement and how best to engage. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. That was great. I love the phrase autocratic internationalism. That's a good one. I hadn't heard that before. Let me just jump in, though, before we go to the next speaker and ask you a tough question, John, if you don't mind. Several times you said the external assistance among them or from the outside made a crucial difference. Crucial to that, I hear that as saying if those instruments were not there, the regimes would be fundamentally different. They'd be fundamentally weakened. All right. What's your benchmark or metric for using the phrase crucial difference? Specifically in the economic area, we talk about flows from China, Russia, whatever. Can you offer some ratios? The aid from China was what % of total external assistance or total imports and exports or total GDP, something to put these flows in perspective. So Tough question. Look forward to your answer. And I know that Ivan will be addressing similar issues going forward.
Sure. I think off the top of my head, it's tough to put a number on this, especially because so many of the flows in recent years have been illicit rather than licit. And so it's difficult to put a number on what gold is being laundered out of Venezuela to the UAE or Turkey or Iran. And it's tough to put a number on the oil that is being shipped out under different flags out of Venezuela. It's simply difficult to do, especially since the Venezuelan government for the past decade or so has done very little accounting of its economics. Similarly, we know that Cuba's accounting is pretty opaque, and increasingly Nicaragua's. So we're dealing with three countries not only that are authoritarian, but as part of their authoritarian strategy have closed their books and certainly are not going to be publishing numbers relating to illicit flows. I know that's not a satisfying answer.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. So now let's move on to Ivan Ellis. Ivan, the floor is yours. I know you have so much knowledge in these areas. Your task is to somehow compress that to 12 to 15 minutes. Thank you for being with us.
Richard, thank you very much. And thanks to the Institute of the Americas for this opportunity to share my thoughts. I'd like to start out by making three overarching observations about the state of authoritarian regimes in Latin America. First, to be a little bit provocative about this, it's interesting in thinking about, except for Nicaragua's semi-voluntary allowing itself to be voted out of office in 1990, it's difficult to think of a moment in which in Latin America, left-wing dictatorships, which have become entrenched in power, have actually ceded power. You can think of many examples of right-wing dictatorships which have, for one reason or another, ceded to political pressures and allowed themselves to be voted, often with a role by the United States. But difficult to think of where an entrenched left-wing dictatorship has allowed itself to voluntarily leave power. Number two, as I think about the answers to some of these questions, is John Polga also very well put it. Many of the answers that we find are similar to what we wrestle with in the era of the Cold War in the Soviet Union or other discourses in other parts of the world about dictatorships, although in a different moment of time. And number three, as we think about the upcoming Summit of the Americas, and I think some of the actions by Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his proclamations about not attending the summit and others, now Bolivia, Honduras, Brazil, possibly many of the states of CARICOM to not attend in a statement of principle over whether Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are not included. It's interesting that the current state of play that we have in Latin America is a region whose multilateral diplomacy, based on its current political orientation, seems to put fraternity and this concept of mutual non-intervention over the principles of advocating for democracy, even in institutions like the OAS. Now, having said those, I want to begin with the three questions that were addressed to me. Number one, the idea of what policy tools are most effective for authoritarian regimes in bolstering their resilience. And as John also rightly pointed out, let me start out with what external actors are doing versus what those regimes do themselves and in helping each others. And obviously externally, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, there are a range of different tools with varying effectiveness, providing of resources, purchasing commodities, loans, providing intelligence support, providing technical support of various types, both in terms of projects and other things, providing political cover in institutions such as the United Nations, oftentimes, which basically prevents certain action from being taken in those areas. And certainly providing security support, as we've seen from the Russians as well as the Iranians in Venezuela, and to a certain degree also powerfully, I think, providing information architecture support, as we've seen with the Chinese, which we'll talk about. And of course, there is the question, although I don't see it as having that much importance as it had symbolic importance, states like China providing support and Russia certainly providing support in the COVID domain. But it's important also to distinguish that in this unique moment of time in Latin America, by contrast to the Soviet Union, virtually all of that support has been provided in pursuit of the own interests of the states, Russia, China, and Iran. Iran has been well remunerated by gold, for example, for many of the swap deals. In the case of Russia, again, its own strategic interest in projecting threats into Latin America and sticking by its friends. Certainly, China also has profited handsomely from the loans for oil deals and the other activities, although certainly with problems. And certainly, all of those regimes have a quasi-ideological component in that all of them facing the United States and the liberal world order as the reference recognize, as John also alluded to, that the persistence of regimes that are pushing back against the United States, such as these, and that don't correspond to a Washington consensus concept, the persistence of those provides a strategic opening for them and strategic benefit in distracting the United States and limiting U.S. Power in its own near abroad. Now, having said this, I would say that with respect to the internal tools that those regimes use, you can look at 6. I mean, number one, I would say absolutely critical empirically in these 3 cases is the non-defection of the armed forces. Sometimes, obviously, that comes from loyalty, but also we've seen, especially in the case of Venezuela, that comes from the penetration of those armed forces. Here, the critical role by Cuban intelligence, the DGI, as well as Venezuela's own DGCIM, as John alluded to. And also certain structural things, the decentralization, for example, that Hugo Chavez very deliberately had done with his armed forces to reduce the possibility that any one part of the armed forces could essentially launch a coup. Also, certainly the corruption of armed forces, particularly in Venezuela, but in the other 2 to a certain degree, has played a role, giving them a stake in the continuity of the regime based on personal liability, the Cartel de las Solas, for example. And at the end of the day, I think one of the things that's been critical in understanding the role of the military has been the persistent domination of lethal force by the military. If we look at other parts of the world and the color revolutions and things like that, there's almost always a moment where the military chooses not to use lethal force. I mean, in Bolivia, it was a critical moment with Evo Morales, also in the contested election. But in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, we've seen that time after time in those challenges, the military has held together using lethal force, 2017, 2019, and that has been critical against unarmed, however massive, protesters. Number 2, control of the basis of livelihood. I think it's important to understand the way in which these regimes are structured, the way in which, for example, in Venezuela, already naturally with the dominance of the oil sector, but during the Chavez years and continuing on, centralizing the control of economic opportunities in the hands of the government, while allowing the rest of the economy to essentially be destroyed, leaving little independent economic basis to live on or eat if you are an opponent of the regime. We can see this through ongoing things like the distribution of clap boxes to Venezuelan supporters. And in that, it's particularly important in controlling the livelihood that when external support from democratic actors is going away, external investors are going away, to have that critical control of the livelihood, you need to have external support. In that regard, the $64 billion of Chinese loans to Venezuela was critical, or for the part of Cuba, getting Venezuelan oil at one point, 100,000 barrels a day was also critical. And certainly for Venezuela, the effect that we see, especially now with the oil swap deals, Iran providing first diluent and now actual heavy oil to Venezuela's refineries, to really basically help Venezuela keep the country running internally as well as for externalities. In addition to that, control of the basis of livelihood, one of the key things that we've seen, I think, emerge as a new phenomenon, especially in Venezuela, is this idea of informally licensed corruption. In other words, it's not just having economic activities that you can divvy out, as we talked about in the previous generation, but this idea that in Venezuela, what you have, for example, the permission of different Zodi commanders, for example, to engage in corruption, whether at the border, the Cartel de las Solas, the effective tolerance for the engagement by senior personnel in the narcotraffics trade, and certainly in the mining arc, where the FARC and especially the ELN, and to a certain extent still the sindicatos and the prenes are permitted to engage in these activities in exchange for essentially their support for the regime. Number 3, obviously, selective repression. And to that regard, we can talk about roundups and torture. We can talk about the DGCIM in Venezuela or Sabine. But in addition to that, the increasingly important role of what you would call decentralized or deniable repression. And you see this in Nicaragua as well, but most notably, you see this with the FAES in Colombia, as well as, or in Venezuela, as well as the colectivos, taking a part of the central blame away from the state. And of course, beyond that, information control becomes very important. And to that extent, the support that you see from, for example, Cuban intelligence to Venezuela, but also China, providing cyber tools, such as, for example, the way in which the Chinese organization CEIEC helped the Venezuelan state Nicolas Maduro spy on Juan Guaido and other things. Or, for example, the way in which Huawei in China helped ECTESA, the Cuban telecommunication agency, use its switching controls in order to basically shut down those July 2021 protests. And there are other things like uncertainty that is important, so that the people during key power struggles feel that even though they might not like the regime, Maduro is deeply unpopular among the rest of the voting bourgeoisie, but there is the sense that your best game in uncertainty is to stay with the regime. And beyond that, also this notion of escape valves. So the ability of 7 million Venezuelans who could not eat or make a living, the ability to just leave, often through Cucuta, but elsewhere. So that effectively has taken pressure off of the regime. Some of those who would be the frustrated people who would turn against the regime for a lack of being able to provide livelihood, if they can just leave, that takes some of that pressure off. Now, the second question that was posed, I want to address, how important is international support, and without that, would they collapse, these regimes? And although I've hinted this already, I would say in general, I see this as a necessary factor in certain ways, and certainly a helpful factor. And I see this in three areas. Number one, as I alluded to, this international support, and I'm particularly talking about the extra hemispheric actors like China and particularly Russia, in providing political cover, especially in United Nations Security Council, essentially paralyzing that multilateral option for dealing with these states. And to a lesser extent, we see the way in which both in the hemisphere, especially that complicates the ability to get an OAS consensus. We worked before with, for example, the Lima group and other things, although it's interesting to see how the changing political context of Latin America is really giving even more political cover to these regimes. Again, as we've already seen with the Summit of the Americas and where AMLO is right now. Number two, the foreign support, the external support provides, as we've alluded to, resources to survive. And again, I've already alluded to this, the key role of Venezuelan oil going to Cuba, which continued even as Venezuela was sanctioned, as John noted, the Chinese and Russian purchases of Venezuelan oil and the key role that they played in conjunction with PDVSA as it really technologically and technically, went into default as a bloated, corrupt organization, and keeping that oil flowing and purchasing that oil and structuring ways so that, especially for Russia and some Chinese smaller companies, so that even under sanctions, that oil could be purchased, often with ship-to-ship transfers off of Malaysia, et cetera, and oftentimes providing technical support as others in the West, like Halliburton and Schlumberger, pulled out. Of course, in that regard, I would call attention to the Iranian oil swaps, and of course, Iran's role has gone back for quite some time, but in the oil sector, we first really started to see this with the Amaway refinery when the Mahan air flights began to come in and bring essentially Chinese parts with Iranian expert to try to bring that refinery back online. We began to see back in September of 2021 Iran agreeing to provide essentially light oil dilutants so that Venezuela could get its heavy oil out and sell it to other parts of the world. And of course, with this new series of 4 agreements that Iran just recently signed and 4 MOUs and 2 agreements, it seems to put Venezuela on track to farther expand its production capability. And certainly with respect to military, we've got the Iranian Mojaher 6 drones, you have the Russian military equipment. Frankly, I see the Russian military equipment not playing that important of a role in terms of helping the Venezuelans to control their population, but actually in placating the populations. Whereas the Chinese support, like the VN-1 armored personnel carriers and things like that, I think have been more critical to control. Certainly, there are helpful tools. Cuba giving Venezuelan intelligence and political guidance, China providing security and control equipment, including things like the Carnet de la Patria. You have certainly the Chinese telecom equipment provided to Cuba in Venezuela. But in my mind, the question of without support, would they survive? I would frankly say yes, certainly the extra hemispheric actors. First of all, because those regimes, thanks in part to Chinese money, thanks in part to other support, have already become incubated. In other words, their elites, as we've already talked about from our internal discussion, are in a position where they're locked in with really no better way out other than following this to the way down. I would say that at critical moments, for example, Iran helping with Venezuela's oil and things like that, some of those key interventions have staved off crisis. But in general, I think at the end of the day, it's the incubation period rather than the keeping in power period in this authoritarian cycle that's critical. But certainly, on the other hand, pressure from those authoritarian friends to change postures could play a decisive role in moving them in a different direction. And then finally, the question, are different external governments collaborating in their support for authoritarian regimes in a way that's exploitable? From what I've seen over the years, I have not seen any evidence of close collaboration, for example, between Russia and China on Venezuela. Certainly, there was at least one Russia-China summit, I believe, in Beijing on this issue. But in general, I think what they're driven by are the shared objectives. Both benefit from the persistence of these anti-U.S., anti-democratic, anti-free market regimes for their own separate strategic reasons. In many ways, China benefits from Russia doing provocative things, as we've seen from military support, to the way that increases destabilization without China being tainted. Russia benefits from the quantity of money that China has provided, which has been far, far, far greater than what China has provided. So there's mutual benefit, although there are at times tensions over issues such as who gets the military sales, with the most of the Russian equipment being bought by the Venezuelan army, and later the Bolivarian National Guard and the Venezuelan naval infantry buying most of the Chinese equipment, but a little bit of a tension there. But again, at the end of the day, nobody, not Russia, not China, are in a hurry to help the United States solve its problems with regimes like this. I will say, though, and this was really highlighted by the situation with Ukraine and the ongoing unprovoked invasion by Russia, is that China is, I think, worried in certain occasions of being embarrassed by bad behavior. And that oftentimes pushes them into caution, sometimes also being worried about not being touched by sanctions. And I saw this in 2020, leads them to at least take a lower profile or hesitate in terms of open economic engagement in ways that Russia otherwise don't. And then I guess to conclude, this idea of, does it make sense? How do we work together? And I agree with what John said. There's a difficult path between trying to engage these regimes and trying to engage others. To me, bringing Russia and China at the table, as we saw in the Mexico City democracy talks, probably empowered them in their role in the region in a way that strategically did not provide benefit to the United States. In many ways, the issues of oil sanctions is a tricky one. The difficult decision, for example, of taking down Rosneft trading and the collateral damage in Europe. But at the end of the day, it is important to engage them to some degree and not do things with those authoritarian regimes that farther open up these very dangerous windows that we see, as we saw from the Yuri Borisov visit in the Russia-Venezuela military cooperation and some of the Russian threats to deploy military forces to Venezuela and Cuba. At the end of the day, it is critical not just because of democracy in the region, but also in the way in which these authoritarian regimes create openings for extra hemispheric actors to come in that present strategic threats to the United States as well. And so those are my remarks. I look forward to the question and answer. And
thanks so much. That was a tremendous amount of material packed in there. I did want to, if this is okay, Ivan, just to draw attention to what my main takeaway. You started off by talking about the durability of these regimes, and then you went on to say that, I think you quoting, that they would survive even without some of this international collaboration, although there may have been critical moments in their history when perhaps they wouldn't have survived without that international collaboration. And that confirms one of the points that I think that was made repeatedly yesterday, which is that it's really sort of early on before these regimes are fully consolidated that that the international community might have more of an opportunity to turn events around. But once they are, as you put it, inculcated elites or entrenched elites, that then, of course, even without some of this international collaboration, they would still endure. That is to say, what we've been referring to as authoritarian resistance. So is that a fair wrap up of some of your key points, Ivan?
I absolutely agree with you, Richard. And I think one of the key things is also to focus on the internal mechanisms for regime survival and dynamics, and understanding how the external actually interfaces with that. Because in some cases, that can make the critical difference or not, but it's really about the internal dynamics and how the external actors interface with that. But absolutely, where we're going right now, I think is, the risk is in Venezuela, for example, chaos or meltdown, fractionalization of the criminal economies in the interior of Venezuela, more than a transition towards democracy. But I think right now we're beyond Russia and China.
Thank you. I think the idea, the interface between the external and the internal is a point that I'm always making to my students. And of course, it's very hard to sort of unravel those, but it's critical to understand that interaction. So now I will hand the floor over to Cindy. I wanted you to see that I've been displaying your book here. And so now the floor is in the hands of the very capable hands of my dear friend, Cynthia Arnson.
Just wanted to thank Richard for the kind introduction. Also thank the Institute of the Americas for this invitation to join you. I feel that I really have very little to add to the comprehensive presentations that were made by John and Evan. And I thank Richard for highlighting the publication on Venezuela's authoritarian allies, which is a comprehensive look at Venezuela's relationships with Russia, China, Cuba, Turkey, and India, and Iran. So it looks at the variety of interests. John and Richard were both contributors. And so I feel like I've learned a lot from their essays in that publication. But let me just run through some of the major points and perhaps summarize, I think, some of the ways that people have been talking about this issue. There are, I think, 4 principal avenues through which external powers give support to authoritarian regimes. One, obviously, economic. In the case of Cuba, for many years under the Soviet Union, received massive amounts of economic assistance. In the contemporary era, China has been a lifeline for Venezuela at first, lending it tremendous amounts of money, most of it being repaid in shipments of Venezuelan oil, but also recently Venezuela has been receiving cash in exchange for those exports. You see it in the case of Iran. Evan has pointed out to the collaboration of Iran in providing diluents and also heavy oil to keep the Venezuelan oil industry functioning at a fairly low level. You see it in Venezuela in the case of Turkey, which has been a key way that Venezuela has been able to market gold, most of it mined illegally by small miners in southern Venezuela, but also in areas controlled by Colombian guerrillas, the ELN, with the collaboration of members of the Venezuelan military. There's also obviously military support. We saw this recently in the cases of Venezuela, also in Nicaragua, the provision of significant amounts of arms from Russia to those 2 countries, both weapons, but machine guns, that kind of thing, but also in the case of Venezuela, strategic bombers and advisors to fly those bombers and maintain them, which were deployed at very strategic moments when the Trump administration, for example, was using the language of keeping all options on the table to pose the threat or keep Venezuela off balance in terms of the possibility of a US military intervention, and that led to the visit of these strategic bombers. There's intelligence support. Again, this has been most crucial. The most prominent example that I can cite is the way that the Cuban intelligence forces and military have provided support to the Venezuelan armed forces and intelligence service to especially spy on the military and root out any sources of dissent from within the armed forces. And it's notable that among the number of political prisoners in Venezuela, some 300 or so, it's kind of a revolving door, so it's hard to keep on top of the exact number, but a significant portion, at least a third, if not more, are military officers. So Cuba has provided that kind of training. There's a lot made in the United States about the number of Cuban advisors who are actually in Venezuela, and I think the numbers are not as important as the kinds of support that Cuba has given to the Venezuelan intelligence and military forces. And then a fourth area, of course, is technology, and those examples have already been cited, but I'll just repeat them, especially the export of Chinese surveillance equipment to Venezuela and undoubtedly to other countries to spy on people, to provide the kinds of infrastructure and software that allow the Venezuelan government to issue the Carnet de la Patria, the homeland card with which Venezuelan civilians are able to access benefits from the state, including food baskets. Now, does this ensure the survival of regimes? I think the key determinants are still internal, and those issues have been raised in the earlier presentations. The coherence of the armed forces, the police, and the military is critical to maintaining maintaining regime survival. And as a way of building allegiance, there's not only the rooting out of people who might be dissidents, but there is the distribution of economic benefits and control over strategic sectors of the economy. In the most prominent case that I know of in Venezuela, control of food distribution, control of mining, control of ports, and control at various times of PDVSA, the oil company, the state-owned oil company. There are also opportunities to profit from illegal economies with complete impunity, be they narco-trafficking or the extraction and export of gold. Less critical, but I still think nonetheless significant, is unity within the movement or the political movement that supports regimes, and this would include the civil service. Their role in supporting the government or in breaking with the government, not just as individuals, but more en masse, and the way that those kinds of breaks can influence or influence internally the dynamics within the public security forces. There is a question about what policy instruments are available to the international community to address the consolidation of authoritarianism. And I would agree with whatever was said yesterday, that the easiest way or the best time to influence is early on. There are divergent interests between the governments that are supporting various authoritarian regimes. They are not in coordination. China, Russia have different motives. For China, it was primarily economic. For Iran, it's ideological. For Russia, it has been a kind of tit for tat way to interfere in the Western Hemisphere, the US sphere of influence, in the same way that Putin has felt that the West has interfered in its so-called near abroad, and we're seeing that played out in the tragic scenarios now in Ukraine. The policy instruments that the US has, obviously diplomatic, isolation, condemnation in various UN or OAS bodies, but the tool that's deployed, I think, most often are sanctions, are various forms of economic sanctions as well as individual sanctions. And the question is, are those effective? And I think that it's very easy to dismiss the utility or question the utility of sanctions because regimes simply do not collapse because the US is trying to make the economy and the regime cry uncle. There is an important message of condemnation to stand by and do nothing, as the Nicaraguan government was jailing all of its opponents in advance of the November 21 presidential elections, would have sent a terrible signal to Nicaraguan society, to democratic actors around the region, that the United States simply doesn't care. I think individual sanctions are more appropriate than broad-based economic sanctions, which tend to impact most profoundly ordinary citizens, from job loss to lack of access to basic needs. They also have the effect of creating what James Bosworth in this volume on Venezuela calls the axis of the sanctioned. Iran was involved with Venezuela during the time of Hugo Chavez, a way of showing that it was not isolated in the world, but the kind of economic and ideological tightening that has occurred under Maduro is in response to US sanctions against both countries. And so there is a way that sanctioned countries tend to unify and support one another. And I'll end, and I think Richard is probably in the best position to address this issue about whether there are divergent interests. And I think he has pointed out in his essay on Cuba in the Venezuela volume, is that historically, Cuba and Venezuela have been competitors for influence and dominance, if you will, in the Caribbean basin. And the divergences between these two regimes are not things that the United States has exploited in any kind of meaningful way. It's questionable whether it would still be possible to exploit that divergence, but nonetheless, there are possibilities if they are identified at the correct time. So I'll end there. Thank you again.
Thanks, Cindy. That was really terrific. Again, in trying to sort of disentangle the external and the internal, you chose to emphasize that the key determinants are internal, although as we recognize, there's this interaction between the external and the internal. But still, it's important to try to unravel that distinction for the following policy implication, namely that if one really thinks that these regimes are completely dependent upon external props, and that if somehow those external props were removed, the regimes would suddenly become very vulnerable and either collapse or be willing to enter into serious negotiations with their opposition. If we felt that, that would be a very important implication for policy. If, on the other hand, these regimes do display significant authoritarian resilience, if you will, that they've used aid over the years, but to strengthen their internal control capabilities, then that gives us a different analysis with regard to the vulnerability of such regimes and the extent to which sanctions could bring them to heal. Now, we may want to use sanctions, as you're pointing out, Cindy, for signaling purposes of virtue, let's say, but that shouldn't lead us to think that those sanctions will bring about changes internally necessarily within countries, which is a different goal. Okay, if either of you have comments on each other's presentations, do we have any? John, Yvonne, Cindy, do you want to comment a bit on what each of you have said? If not, let me underscore a bit and take us to the Cindy's last point when she talked about the possibility of, and Jorge Castaneda raised this issue in his presentation yesterday, the Venezuelan-Cuban relationship. Historically, actually, they were, of course, competitors for influence in the very small pond of the Caribbean basin. One might imagine that if in fact we believe that the Venezuelan government is very dependent upon Cuban security and intelligence assistance, that one might think would give the Cubans significant leverage in Venezuela. Is there, if we want to try to pursue negotiations of some sort in Venezuela, is there an opportunity to enlist Cuba as a constructive partner in such a negotiation? Or is this just outside of the realm of realism? Ivan or John, would you care to comment?
It's a great question, Richard. So first of all, I think Cuba is very good, as you well know, of doing what is in Cuba's interest. And so, time and time again, I mean, as occurred under the Obama administration, if we approach Cuba, Cuba will say, okay, what can we get out of this for us, Cuba, without necessarily undermining our strategic position, which has in part to do with its alliance. I mean, Cuba has strategically very little to gain by publicly abandoning a quasi-socialist ally. And so I think that would be very tricky. But I think that the key thing that your question points out is differentiating between things that enable and things that are necessary. In other words, you think, for example, of the Cuban DGI, and if you just took that support away today, is this something that's so fundamental it would cause the Venezuelan regime to collapse? I mean, my sense is that has become it's not something that Venezuela depends on so much as it is a thing that now creates an impediment to the generation of military coups and things like that. But there are a lot of other things in motion that are also behind that calculus. So in many ways, it's part of the glue that holds things together. But if you take away that piece, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a fungible, negotiable commodity that we can go to Havana to talk about.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. Yes, Cindy, please.
Sure. I think we need to remember that Cuba played a very important and positive role in the peace negotiations in Colombia. The talks actually went forward in Havana, and the Obama administration, I think, has acknowledged that Cuba played a helpful role. So the question, and I would leave this, Richard, perhaps to you with much greater expertise on the internal dynamics, in Cuba, as to whether there are things that the Cuban regime wants that would inspire it to play a constructive role. And I think that the idea that Cuba somehow is providing the intelligence support or the solidarity with Venezuela because Venezuela has given it oil is completely wrong. I mean, there's no doubt that the Cuban government values the subsidies that it has received over the years, now much reduced, but still ongoing. But the principle, I mean, it's not a mercantile kind of exchange. I mean, I think the ideological connection is extremely important. And that said, is there a way that Cuba could be induced to play a helpful role in bringing about a negotiation? I'm not sure that would happen until there are reasons that the Venezuelan government itself feels motivated to engage in some kind of dialogue or negotiations. There was a sense that might have been the case some months ago when the Norway mediated talks began in Mexico, that there were divisions within the Chavista movement, that there were many people within the regime who realized that economic recovery was never going to take place until sanctions were lifted. And now the Venezuelan economy has started to recuperate, in tiny little ways. Dollarization is far advanced for a lot of internal as well as external transactions. The price of oil is obviously a great boon to what had been a moribund industry. Now, again, these are improvements at the margin. When you think that just during the years that Maduro has been in power, the economy has contracted by 80%. I mean, it's really quite shocking. So, when you go from 1,000,000% inflation to 2,000% inflation, you're still dealing with severe economic problems. But I think there are people, that we all talk to within Venezuela who say that the regime does not feel much need to negotiate now, except it is interested in sanctions relief. And probably not so much the oil sanctions, more the individual sanctions, the criminal indictments of members of Maduro and his inner circle. And so the question is, whether any of those are really on the table in exchange for movement towards a liberalization, towards an opening of some kind, towards free elections that would be internationally monitored. That remains to be seen. The United States has not put forth anything, and may not, given the very harsh bipartisan condemnation of this, very modest initiative where you had, White House State Department officials going to Venezuela to talk to Maduro, and the blowback from that has been substantial. So, to expect that they're going to try that again, I think is very unlikely, certainly in advance of the November midterms.
Thanks, Cindy. Well, we had a very excellent presentation by Jeff Davidow yesterday, and he underscored some of the internal contradictions or problems in the making of U.S. foreign policy, and how difficult it is for the U.S. to exert the sort of power that you might think we would have, particularly in light of the asymmetries of size and power in the Caribbean basin, and yet our inability to really maintain strong, coherent policies because of all the domestic, institutional and ideological and partisan divides that we have here. To try to answer the question with Cuba, of course, there's a lot that the Cubans would like from us. I mean, just to start simply allowing remittances, something as simple as that, which would net them $2 or $3 billion a year, perhaps, would be a huge inducement. But there are obviously severe political problems on both sides. On the Cuban side, the complete lack of trust. How would they know that we wouldn't turn around, in 24 hours and reverse any relaxation of sanctions, since they've been whipsawed so dramatically, in the last several years? So that lack of trust on the Cuban side would certainly be very important. On the issue of security assistance, though, I'm always a little uncertain. First of all, of course, it's very hard to have good information by the definition of intelligence and counterintelligence. It's obviously closely held. But I do have the feeling that maybe whatever security assistance the Cubans had provided to the Venezuelans, presumably that technology transfer has occurred over many years. And also a lot of these surveillance technologies, after all, can be purchased on the market. We see this now in the case of these various reports we're getting out of the Ukraine, all the hacking that's going on, public, private, criminal, governmental. I mean, there's a lot of technology out there. So I don't know that the Venezuelans are necessarily dependent upon either Chinese or Cuban technology at this point. But let me take us in a slightly different direction now with our remaining time. The recent shifts in geopolitics, does this matter? On the Chinese side, there's this increasing sort of decoupling that's occurring at a global level. China itself has its problems with supply chains and its very strict COVID regimes. When I look at the numbers, it seems to me, and I'm interested in your commentary, that Chinese willingness to take some economic risks in either of the three countries seems to have diminished. Certainly, Chinese trade with Cuba is down sharply. Chinese also trade with Venezuela. They're interested in sort of getting repaid rather than increasing their risks. And although there's some noise in Nicaragua, I have yet to see really serious, concrete financial transfers from China. So that's on the Chinese side, which seems like a reluctance to increase their exposure. And then Russia, of course, one might imagine they have their hands full, and whether or not they'd be willing to seriously undertake new initiatives in the faraway Caribbean basin, something one would have to sort of at least question. So I'm interested in the three panelists' reactions to, we've talked a lot about what's been happening in the past and in the last year or two, but how about going forward in the new geopolitical environment? Do we see some change in the opportunities for international collaboration? Yvonne, I saw your hand. Did you want to go first? Then John, then Cindy, please.
Sure, no, absolutely. So I think when you look at kind of the hierarchy of willingness to incur these risks, you certainly, Iran is at the top. I mean, already heavily sanctioned, really largely nothing to lose in actually collaborating to try to avoid sanctions. We see that now with the deepening of the oil swap agreement. I think you find Russia in the middle, and China oftentimes follows because of both the risks of operating in places like Venezuela and the economic case in places like Venezuela and Cuba, and also because it is exposed to its economic engagements to the West in the United States elsewhere, it tends to be a little bit more subtle. But in all of those cases, I think there's a lot of room for moving forward. I would say, I clearly see the Iran deal, which also included, and this didn't get a lot of coverage, also providing oil to Nicaragua, et cetera. I see that Iran presence expanding. In the case of Russia, as you pointed out well, Richard, I think that at least for the near term, both because of the sanctions impact and because of the resource diversion in Ukraine, Russia has very little to actually offer, although it certainly could do a low-cost thing to project a threat into the region, as it did during the Crimea conflict in 2008, as it did during the first phase of Ukraine back in 2013, et cetera. Although, again, Russia has some sensitivities. I mean, we saw this, for example, with the caution of, for example, Rosneft trading when it was openly evading sanctions, and how it had to basically reconstitute itself after we took the probably unexpected decision to sanction it. So I think there is a certain amount of caution there. I think in the case of China, what you find is that in Cuba, as you know well, Richard, part of the problem was until the Obama administration opening, there really wasn't a money case. You had some Chinese providing of cars and electric buses and other things, but there just wasn't the economic case until the prospect of Cuba opening up to the United States with the Mariel and all of that. And then you saw the Chinese scrambling to come in. And I think the Chinese interest waned a little bit after the Trump administration reimposed those restrictions. And I think the same thing in Venezuela. With respect to China, it had there were a lot of deals that went very bad, and yet it's often underappreciated the degree to which those deals were structured so that the Chinese got paid, even when the Venezuelans were not only defaulting on loans and not paying Halliburton and Schlumberger, but were even defaulting on the Russians. Although in recent times, even the Chinese had to accept some postponement of the little, about 15 billion that remains in their debt payment. But I actually see signs that the Chinese are coming back. I think U.S. sanctions relief emboldened them. And also there were some indications that already CNPC is having preliminary conversations of coming back to bringing up oil production in those oil fields. But again, the Chinese, and I empirically have always looked to our signal to try to at least appear to be in compliance, even to the point where when you had those ship-to-ship transfers off of Malaysia, which was actually probably not authorized by essentially Chinese profiteers, the Chinese suddenly moved in to shut that down a little bit. But I think the decisions that we make in the United States about engaging with the Maduro regime, we have to be very conscious of the fact that not only creates latitude for the Maduro regime, but that actually creates latitude for other extrahemispheric actors to become more bold in their engagement, which gives you a ripple effect.
So let me, so you said specifically that you see China as coming back. So let's maybe we could elaborate. I mean, one could imagine that from the point of view of both Russia and China, since our relations, US relations are deteriorating with those two countries, that they might want to try to create problems for us in our near abroad. Do you see any indication of that type of reaction?
Well, I think especially since that statement that President Xi and President Putin made during the Beijing Olympics, and then just how badly that the war has gone for Russia and its egregious human rights violations. I think China, in traditional fashion, just as it did with Kim Jong-un, just as it did with Nicolas Maduro, has kind of backed off a little bit because it didn't want to be tainted by that. To me, the Chinese are famous for they always want to benefit from the aggressive actions of others, but they always want to sidestep being tainted by those actions. And so what I see now is, now that it's becoming okay, Juan Gonzalez and these conversations to re-engage, I think the Chinese are edging back into that space. But again, they're still worried about the money angle. They're still worried about the political risk. I think they're still worried about a number of other things. So I think they're cautiously looking for signals. But one of the other interesting things is, as Russia has become economically crippled over Ukraine, a lot of that actually increases opportunities for the Chinese, not only as a purchaser of goods and things like that, but some of those allies that have relied most closely on Russia, now may not be getting as much support as they like, and that opens doors for the Chinese.
Okay, thank you. John, did you want to comment as well on this?
It's difficult to follow Evan, which is why I wanted to go first. I can't talk about China after he has. I agree 100%. China's not going anywhere, right? But that doesn't mean that China will return in a sense of propping up dictatorships, right? Because I try to make the point that I don't think that China was trying to do that in the first place in Latin America. It had allies and was making inroads in places that the United States had, for better or for worse, had left. Research has shown that China has made the most inroads in Latin America in places and contexts where the US has withdrawn, right? But also, as Evan pointed out, China has been non-confrontational about that, right? It doesn't want to cause it doesn't want to cause problems or start an armed conflict in the Western Hemisphere, right, which is far away from its own neighborhood. I think if we look, though, again at U.S. policy, this speaks to what the U.S. can do and what the dangers are of different policies in terms of withdrawing or isolating countries. In 2005, I believe, the U.S. passed a law prohibiting the sales of arms to Venezuela because of non-compliance with, I believe, DEA flyovers or anti-terrorism initiatives or something. And as a result, Chavez immediately pivoted to Russia, and that is when he made bulk purchases of Russian arms between 2005 and 2008, right? Which is why you have tanks and jets and things like that right now and helicopters in Venezuela that can only be serviced by Russians and can only get replacement parts from Russia, and explains why there are 400 to 600 Russian soldiers on the ground at all times in Venezuela, right? And it relates to that, and it speaks to how policy needs to be medium and long term rather than short term. And I think if the Chinese and Russians have shown anything, it's that they understand that foreign policy is something that is long term in nature.
Yeah. Well, our political system has a lot of trouble keeping our eye on the ball. We also have a lot of trouble, I think, in seeing secondary consequences of our actions. I mean, after all, most sanctions are the result of domestic political pressure. Something happens in country X that the American media, et cetera, say this is bad. The cry goes out, we must do something. The United States has to act. We have to show these are bad guys. We have to assert our moral and national interest positions. Well, we don't want to invade, but we have to show something. So economic sanctions is the tool of first resort. And so the politics dictate a quick sanction of one sort or another. And if you dribble them out, you can get many days of positive headlines listing all the bad guys that have been sanctioned. But do we then stop and think, well, how is the target country going to react? I mean, they have a certain agency as well. Do they have options of different sorts? Will these sanctions cause them to tighten up or loosen up? Will it cause them to not look so much abroad and look more to the US, or the reverse? And Cindy used the phrase, what the axis of the sanctioned, which is a phrase that's increasingly one hears around vis-a-vis what seems to be going on now with Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, as they sort of express solidarity among themselves in light of the very heavy US and NATO sanctions against Russia. Do we have any comment? Is there something about US diplomacy in the hemisphere which is driving these countries closer together when presumably we would rather see them splinter so that our leverage would be enhanced? Any comments about how we might avoid an axis of the sanctioned here in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, first, Richard, I wanted to thoroughly agree with what you just said, and having lived that myself in the policymaking space. And I'm not sure if it's just the political pressure, but also I think sometimes it's the desire for action. But I would put another dimension on that, and the difference between today and 20 years ago, when you get into Treasury, OFAC, and things like that, is there's the illusion that we can be more precise and targeted with these sanctions. We can name particular individuals, and so it leads you into a do loop of, okay, who do we sanction? Who do we blame? Who can we go after? We can do this without at least directly hurting in a blanket way populations. It's like the difference between precision guided munitions and carpet bombing in the days of old. And coupled with the fact that oftentimes, as you rightly pointed out, especially in recent years, there's a real reluctance of what, do we really have military options that, and so it becomes a very compelling thing. But I would also note that it's not just sanctions, but it also goes to Treasury. It goes to state and visa policy. And the one that's always been a difficult piece that we haven't talked about is the role of the Justice Department, because you have, basically credible indictments and naming, which you saw in Venezuela as well. But the interesting thing there is that justice, being very independent about the purity of its process, is oftentimes reluctant to just say, okay, the NSC Latin America director can't say, okay, start investigating that person. Justice doesn't work that way. But you do have all of these tools. I think, yeah, the lack of other good options of how we change the policy of sovereign states to do things that we don't like or that threaten us. It's a dilemma, especially in the interconnected post-war era.
Richard, if I could just jump in, I couldn't.
Yes, please, Cindy.
With the last statement that Evan made. I mean, I think the foreign policy instruments that we have are all imperfect. And there's a sense, somehow a sense that what the United States does can produce a change in behavior. And that's not always the case. So some of the, I think, effort is signaling. I don't think you or I would oppose or would have opposed, and quite the contrary, the cutoff of military assistance to the Pinochet dictatorship or to the junta, in Argentina. Did that cause those governments to fall? No, but it was an important signal, an important statement, an important message, and I think that so there is a place for sanctions, without having the illusion that this is necessarily going to lead to a desired outcome. But that kind of sanctioning, the message that's sent by sanctioning, I think is an important one. And the challenge is to target them. And what we have against Venezuela now is, financial sanctions, oil sanctions, individual sanctions, and secondary sanctions, which makes it technically illegal for third countries such as India to be trading. And I'd like to just go back to this other point about China. The bulk of China's involvement in the region is economic and doesn't have anything to do with authoritarian states. It has to do with copper in Peru and Chile and soybeans and beef, and iron ore from Brazil, and export markets for Chinese goods. Cuba and Nicaragua are complete small potatoes in terms of any kind of economic benefit or interest that China might have. And in the case of Venezuela, after the 68 billion or so amount of loans, there's no new money. There's a sense of, buyer's remorse. They are insisting on repayment of the loans in oil. That will probably continue. To my knowledge, Venezuela has not defaulted as it were, on its export of oil to China. And probably what's going to take place is a greater effort by the Chinese to acquire Venezuelan oil fields, to control them directly. Up until now, it had to be in partnership with PDVSA. That also may be a policy that's relaxed by the Maduro regime in order to attract more investment and get more oil flowing that would serve as a source of income. So, because it has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, Venezuela is on the radar screen of the Chinese. These other smaller countries that are profoundly authoritarian are not so much of interest.
Thanks, Cynthia. Those were important correctives. John, let me, we only have about 5 minutes left, and I want to take advantage of the presence here of two experts in security issues. There's a lot of talk about how the external actors provide various forms of security assistance, particularly counterintelligence, cybersecurity, the use of information and disinformation. Historically, of course, one thought of the United States as being a major provider of these various forms of security assistance. Now we have, this is a new age, right? And the use of disinformation is that it was always there, of course, but now it's at a whole nother level with the use of social media, et cetera. We have hacking, the ability to take down entire systems, overnight. One would think that, for example, in the case of Nicaragua, it wouldn't take very much to completely turn off their utilities, for example. One could imagine it wouldn't be very difficult to make the security apparatus completely blind so that there was no information flowing vertically. So my question to you guys is countermeasures. Okay, so we see security assistance coming in from unfriendly sources. Are there no countermeasures that the United States, perhaps in coordination with our friends in the region, that could take in these areas, particularly of information flow and cyber?
So very, very quickly, other than essentially isolation containment at these stages and certain things to provide essentially security assistance to the neighbors of these actors, such as Colombia, for example, in the case of Venezuela, that are threatened by these actions, I'm not sure. The time actually to do the other measures are, as in other cases, when these regimes are in their consolidation phases, when the regimes are making the choice of whether, the Argentine government, whether they go with the Chinese FC-1 fighter, whether or not certain countries go with Huawei information architectures or the deployment of surveillance systems with certain capabilities, et cetera, et cetera. Because by the time those regimes are hostile anti-U.S. actors, it's generally they're going to do what they want to do. I mean, there's some capability of touching companies with sanctions, but that's very limited. But what I would also point out is two things. One is that the nature of assistance by each of those external actors is very different. So you have kind of onesies and twosies with Iran, like the Mojahir drones to the Venezuelans, and in some cooperation with Kavim. In the Russian case, again, you have right now, it's the Russians have stopped selling bulk arms, which John alluded to, the $12 billion of basically reconstituting the Venezuelan armed forces. But right now, it's helping the Venezuelans solve particular problems, such as, for example, the Russians coming into Apure and helping them to try to deal with this challenge with the ELN and the FARC there. I think with the Chinese, it's been more about information architectures and frankly, security vehicles that you've seen providing, repression and other kind of citizenship control architecture, such as Cynthia alluded to with Carnet de la Patria. But the one final thing, Cindy made a fantastic point, and I really want to, I think it's really important in this discussion, which is, and I absolutely agree that China does not not seek to create or support authoritarian states per se. China seeks to support and perpetuate its friends. If Justin Trudeau and Canada declared itself against the United States and 100% open to Chinese investment tomorrow, China would be, I think, just as enthusiastic about the Canadians. Or that may say something about but I think the issue is it is the authoritarian regimes that are most in need and most politically disposed to being China's best friends, and that creates a certain cycle. And at the end of the day, those authoritarian friends are also useful to China in strategic ways, because the way in which indirectly, as long as China doesn't get blamed for it, they undermine U.S. influence and control in the region.
Thank you very much. John, did you want to add to that?
I'll just add very briefly, I agree largely with what Evan said. The time for the United States to act is in the past in those countries, the consolidation phase. But that teaches us a lesson, which is that we can't take our eye off of other places that might be attracted to those security and informational infrastructures that could be damaging to U.S. interests and to their own country's interests into democracy in the future. And so that includes a number of countries that I shall refrain from naming, but that are certainly we could consider to be hybrid regimes today. I also would like to go back very briefly to Cindy's point, previous point, which I almost completely agree with, although I would add that China does have interests in Cuba and Nicaragua are not just small potatoes in one sense, and that is diplomatically. If we look at Latin American countries that maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan, that number continues to drop, right? Panama, the DR, El Salvador, Nicaragua, they have fallen by the wayside. And that certainly is part of Chinese strategy as well, a long-term strategy, and a long-term strategy that it's been 60 years in the making.
That's one of the so we talk about getting in early before these regimes are consolidated. So that immediately makes everybody here think of El Salvador, okay, today. But that still doesn't really tell us what to do. So much depends upon the assessment of, well, really, who is Bukele, for example? What really is he up to? So do we want to try to do what I think the administration is trying to do right now in Honduras, which is take a bet that if we engage, maybe we can bring Xiomara Castro into a reasonably friendly posture? Or should we recognize that these regimes or leaders are incorrigible, they're a threat, and we have to do something to oust them before it's too late? So the mere decision that there's an impending problem here, that doesn't tell you what's to be done, right? You could still take that in various different directions. Cindy, did you want to comment, please?
Sure, and it's not just what is to be done. I completely agree that El Salvador is in this sort of transition to authoritarianism, but not yet there. So if you take that as a case of where the United States could potentially intervene early on, what do you do? I mean, the foreign policy instruments are very imperfect, as is and I think the assumption is wrong that the United States has the ability to change the course of these regimes, particularly when there's internal support for what the government is doing. And I think, we don't have to talk about the El Salvadorian case, but Bukele is probably the most popular president in the entire region right now. There are very few impediments internally. And so the idea that somehow if the United States can intervene with this, that, and the other thing, it's going to change course, I don't share that assumption.
Okay, so
that could nothing, but no. Be limited in your expectations.
Well, which takes us back really to the yesterday's discussions about, despite the apparent asymmetries of power between the United States and these smaller countries of the Caribbean basin, nevertheless, our ability to manipulate the internal affairs has its limits, particularly in the case of very clever leaders like Bukele seems to be, at least up to this point in time, right? How Biden would love to have Bukele's approval ratings, right? Okay, I think that takes us actually a little bit past our assigned time here. So I think this has been a super rich conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. I think we agree on many things, perhaps not on all things, but that's good. A little discussion and differences of opinion is certainly to be welcomed. So thank you all very much, Yvonne, John, and Cindy.